One of Generation 2's most significant changes was the addition of a new type, or two types rather, with Dark and Steel. Despite fans constantly on the lookout for more types to be added in future releases, to this day we're still waiting for the Sound type. It wouldn't happen again for 4 generations, 14 years after Gold and Silver's 1999 release, when X and Y introduced the Fairy type. And ever since that introduction, Fairy types have excelled, even dominated. They were incredibly well designed, perfectly engineered for competitive success. What specifically has rocketed the Fairy type to the top? That's what we'll be exploring today. The Fairy type's origin as a much needed nerf to the overbearing, overpowered Dragon type is well known. However, Fairies offer so much more than an immunity to the Draco Meteors and outrages that terrorize metagames past. They are fundamentally superb on both offense and defense. The Fairy type is resisted by Steel, Poison, and Fire, but only weak to Steel and Poison. Meanwhile, it hits Dragon, Dark, and Fighting super effectively. Defensively, it's immune to Dragon and resist the latter two, while also resisting Bug. This is a fundamentally excellent set of typing attributes for a type. What particularly stands out is not just its measly 2 weaknesses, but its 2 weaknesses to attacking types that were generally rarely used by virtue of their generally poor coverage. Of course, they improved in viability once Fairies were introduced, but they were still not spammable against the rest of the metagame. Fairies' defensive attributes were also outstanding even beyond the obviously noteworthy Dragon immunity. That one got all the spotlight, and for good reason. However, also highly relevant was not Fairy's resistance to the fighting type that had also been dominant, but the fact Fairy possessed the resistance while not being weak to Ice, Rock, or Dark coverage that had previously destroyed many fighting resists. Not being weak to the latter two also meant it wasn't threatened by Stealth Rock or Pursuit, which were similarly impactful on such resists previously. Fairy's resistance to Dark was also valuable in lieu of the Steel typing losing its resistance to the type, thus helping against newly dangerous Choice Band Crunches and Choice Specs Dark Pulses. Even Fairy resistance to one of the most spammable moves in the game, U-Turn, was significant. Well, all that sounds great, but how did it work in practice on the actual Pokemon who possess more attributes than just being a Fairy type? The answer? Incredibly well. Most Fairy types were blessed with useful stats, occasional secondary typings, and generally deep move pools, which included useful Fairy type stab moves in Play Rough and Moonblast. The most immediately recognizable examples of Fairy type dominance in Gen 6 OU is, of course, Clefable, who perfectly leveraged its new typing in addition to its phenomenal move pool and incredible Magic Guard ability to become so irritating. I have a video you can go check out entirely dedicated to why it seems to never die. It was far more than just Clefable though. Azumarill also established itself as a staple right from early X and Y with its unique, excellent Water Fairy typing, valuable on both offense and defense. As for the Mega Fairy types, well, that was something else entirely. The only reason Mega Mawile isn't thought of as a defining Generation 6 Fairy type is because it was so monstrously broken, spamming obscenely powerful play roughs and having plenty of switching opportunities with its fantastic Steel Fairy typing that it wound up being banned. Though not as quickly as you might expect it. It was right after Aegislash, which was just like Mega Mawile, possessed a Genesect-like ability to not get banned for far longer than it had any right to. After Mega Mawile, much attention shifted to Mega Gardevoir, which many players considered quite broken for how its impossible, pixelate boosted Hyper Voices were to switch into. Like any Fairy type worth its salt, it was able to deal with common Fairy resists, mostly using Focus Blast to shatter Ferrothorn and Heatran, while packing a brutal Stab Psyshock to eviscerate Mega Venusaur. Mega Gardevoir was quickly forgotten once ORAS came around though, as with the new game came Mega Diancie, an even more vicious Fairy type attacker. Another notable addition was Mega Altaria, who was hugely threatening for some time to the point of also being considered broken. The impact of the Fairy type resounded all throughout Generation 6, notably enforcing compromised coverage compared to the standard sets by previous generations. Nowhere was this more significant than how previously unstoppable Dragon Spam teams were reduced to a limp husk of their former selves. Kieran Black of all things had to run Iron Head if it didn't want to be walled by Clefable. Latios even began using Psychic, a move it absolutely did not want to use most of the time given its complete uselessness against its biggest enemy, Tyranitar, but it was helpless against Fairy types otherwise. Fairies were also effective in far more than just OU of course, from Florges, Sylveon, and Whimsicott and UU, to base Diancie, Gramble, and Aromatisse and RU, to Clefairy and Mega Aldino and NU, to Clefairy again alongside base Mawile and Mr. Mime in PU, all the way down to Spritzee and Snubbull in Little Cup. The Fairy type impact was felt everywhere in Generation 6. We have to give a special mention to Ubers of course, where the Fairy type utterly dominated. The tier was defined by Xerneas and its obscene power. Xerneas' best check was also a Fairy type Klefki. Of course, it was the key Steel typing allowed to withstand Xerneas' powerful Geomancy and Fairy Aura boosted Moonblast, but Klefki being half Fairy meant it wasn't weak to Xerneas' Focus Blast. Klefki also used Play Rough as its stab instead of the super effective Flash Cannon because it was a physical attack and thus wasn't stifled by Xerneas' special defense boost, and would actually use Xerneas' own fairy aura against it, since the boost of Play Rough ensured it could break substitutes. Klefki was also an excellent Pokemon in its own right for its spiking capabilities and resistance to the likes of Yveltal and the Soldew Lottie twins. Arceus could also don the Pixie Plate to solid effect. As Arceus Fairy, it acted as a useful check to dangerous threats like Rayquaza, Mega Salamence, and the aforementioned Yveltal. All in all, Generation 6 Fairy type experiment had proved immensely successful absolutely everywhere. Where would it go from there? Well, the way Generation 7 cranked out the excellent Fairy types, it was as if it had been dared to do so, or as if it was a generation that was supposed to be defined by Fairy types' existence. OU quickly became defined by the 5 outstanding new Fairy types added, Magearna and the Tapus. What a great band name. Anyway, all these had significant impacts on the metagame, both offensively and defensively. They weren't the only ones either, as Mega Mawile rejoined the fray while Clefable continued to be important as ever, and Mega Diancie was significant as well. In addition to the myriad fairy offense being thrown around, especially Tapu Lele's perfectly complementary stab combination and Magearna's Z Flare Cannons, the fairy type's defensive utility was more important than ever in light of Greninja attempting to evolve into Ash Greninja through Specs Dark Pulse spam. Magearna especially stood out because it was itself a steel fairy type, which let it act as one of the best checks to all these fairies. Not even the addition of everyone's favorite poison type, Toxapex, could stop fairy types from dominating. Not only did they all have the tools to at least mess with Toxapex, to say nothing of destroying it outright, but they also made for excellent partners with it, with Toxapex resisting their weaknesses beautifully. Fairy's presence continued to make for skewed coverage moves. For example, Zygarde eventually began running Iron Tail more than Stab Outrage, while Garchomp began running Concepts of Crush as a complement to Earthquake rather than Outrage as well. The presence of Tapu Fini and its dragon weakening Misty Terrain was a significant contributor to this, while Tapu Bulu's resistance to ground was another. Meanwhile, Tapu Koko was able to both resist Greninja's Dark Pulse and outspeed it without needing a Choice Scarf, which was as valuable as it was unique. None of these were considered ban-worthy, not even the absolutely unwallable Tapu Lele, who could run Shadow Ball to shatter even Jirachi that thought itself safe. But Mega Mawile and especially Magearna certainly were. The only thing that safely countered offensive Magearna was defensive Magearna. Of course, fairies continued to rule the roost beyond OU. Xerneas returned to Ubers while Fairy Arceus was even better, and what else but Magearna was also excellent. Meanwhile, the new Primarina established itself as one of the most terrifying threats in UU, and base Gardevoir, Florges, and their ilk continued to excel in the tiers below. With Generation 8 on the horizon, everyone wondered how would Game Freak top themselves in their apparent desire to make as many amazing fairy types as possible. Well, they didn't quite, unless you count Ubers, where both forms of Zacian were the most hilariously broken thing since Mega Rayquaza, eventually getting the same treatment. That's the apex of the fairy type right there, going beyond even King Xerneas. As for OU, the additions of Hatterene and Grimmsnarl were significant, but nowhere on par with the tier-shaping fairy types of generations prior, though that was perhaps an unfair point of comparison, given the obscenely high standard those had set right out the gate. Hatterene's Magic Bounce was efficiently utilized on several different types of teams, while Grimmsnarl's Prankster ability made it an excellent screen setter on Hyper Offense. Grimmsnarl's true home lane in VGC was absolutely outstanding. However, in singles, Gen 8's greatest points of fairy type impact were those fairies that already existed. Clefable was outstanding once again, becoming particularly infuriating with its Wish set that utilized the buff teleport to perpetually safely keep its teammates fully healthy. Then once the DLC came around, those monsters from Metagame's past returned. Magearna managed to get itself banned twice, largely off the strength of its incredible spec set in both the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra metagames, while the Tapus immediately shaped the metagame in their image once more once they returned to the Crown Tundra. Well, except Tapu Bulu, who was largely outclassed by Rillaboom. However, the rest were still going strong, even with the power nerfs to the boost given out by Psychic and Electric Terrain, and with the removal of Hidden Power, Tapu Lele and Tapu Koko excelled, whereas Fini gained an important new fairy type stab in Draining Kiss that allowed to somewhat make up for its lack of reliable recovery. Generation 9 continued to give us some of the strongest fairy types of all time, with the Fairy Ghost offensive Flutter Mane, with its base 135 special attack and speed, that could also terrestrialize into a fairy type to boost its Moonblast even stronger, and be powered up by Sun due to photosynthesis. We also got our first fairy fighting type in Iron Valiant, who is the definition of a fantastic mixed attacker. Screamtail was a new fairy psychic that provided wish support for Sun teams and insane speed with Encore. Enamorous, the fourth genie, was finally legal in a competitive game as well. And if Magearna wasn't too much, we also got Tinkaton, the base 160 physical steel move, which is a top tier Pokemon in the UU tier. Of course, they couldn't forget about Magearna, which they buffed even more with access to spikes and Encore. It could also easily sweep with its standard Shift Gear Calm Mind sets, and was so good that it ended up being banned. Not to mention the plethora of Pokemon that terrestrialize into a fairy type, like Garganical, Kingambit, and Skeledirge. In conclusion, fairies are innately designed for success, and they haven't let down their immense potential. They've been amongst the most powerful and important Pokemon of the last several generations, and Generation 9 is no different. If you did enjoy this video, make sure you let me know by leaving a like, and also subscribe to the channel, as I'm on my way to 400k, and everyone who watches this video today could get me there if they subscribed. And check out my previous discussion video on why Pokemon run bad stats on purpose.